It was the largest railroad ever built in the world and one of the most technically sophisticated engineering feats ever done. What's the point of having a brain that's half filled with fake information?
You write in the book that he did more to bring order and justice than an army could have.
There was no safety equipment. Back then, they would just tie a rope around their waist and their friends would lower them down over the cliff. They would have these piles of dynamite with them. They would stuff it into some cracks or put it there. Then they would light it and then yank on the rope for the people to pull them up, and they'd be yanking the person up, and then the massive explosion happened below them. I mean, it's almost like you just think, no, that couldn't possibly have happened. Well, yeah, it did. I mean, it was amazing.
Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. Today I'm speaking with Stephen R. Bown. Stephen is the author of 10 books on the history of exploration, science, and ideas, which have included topics such as scurvy, George Vancouver, and the Hudson's Bay Company. Today he joins me for a discussion about his latest book called Dominion, The Railway and the Rise of Canada. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
In your bio, it says that you were born and raised in Ottawa. I'm interested in what life was like growing up there.
Well, it was a long time ago for someone. I'm not ancient yet, but back I was born in 1967, so as a kid growing up in Ottawa, I was kind of on the fringe of it. It was not that big a place. I mean, like a lot of places in Canada, the population has significantly expanded during my time around. I was in Canada, which used to be outside of Ottawa, but now it's basically connected to Ottawa. So, there was lots of room to play and to, as a kid, to go out and roam around, explore things. It was a very free childhood, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds similar to mine in the 80s as well. I grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan and went to school on my own and sort of had a free-range childhood in many ways growing up in that town. It was great looking back on it.
The free-range childhood. I mean, my kids grew up, one is 20 and one is 22 now, so not really, kids. But it was already, even when they were kids, even where I live in Canmore, which is right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, there's, we're right on the edge of the town that we see elks and coyotes here and deer, and we have all kinds of wildlife that we see right out our windows and on the paths. But kids didn't go out the same way that I remember. There was so much. There was a lot of online things, and the activities were more organized, so they didn't really go wandering off to explore. And I think probably because there wasn't very many kids, it was harder for them to form into a pack. Like I remember when I was growing up, there were a lot of kids around, so you could go and find somewhere and just go and do something, get up to some kind of trouble or explore something, it was possible to do things in a different way than you can now.
In your website biography, it says that you've had a lifelong love of history. How did that first develop?
It's hard to even say why that is. It was not. I couldn't say that history was more popular back then than it is now, because it wasn't, and I was definitely an outlier. There was no one that I knew was interested in history except for me. So, I didn't have any friends who were interested. So who knows? I think part of it was, as you're wandering around, and, I did go out and look at things, and you see historical plaques. My parents used to take me on trips where we would explore around, and we'd go out to the mountains or the ocean on longer trips. I mean, for whatever reason, whenever I looked at things, I was wondering, well, how did it get here? Like, why is there this town here? Because you see a new road being constructed, and you see new houses being built, and you kind of wonder, like, what was here before all of that? And then, I think from then I really had an interest. I said, I want to know, how did it get to where we are at this point in time? Like, I know that it wasn't like this all the time. And of course, in certain areas of the world, like in Canada, the change has been very rapid over the last 100 to 150 years, even if the pace of change was slower before that. So I just always had this idea. I was wondering, like, how did we get here? Because people are always arguing about where we should do in the future, what policy we should have, or what the taxation level should be, or should we have new road going here, or blah, 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 blah. The theater of politics goes on and on. But I always wondered, okay, well, if we don't know how we came to where we are now, how can we even have an opinion on what we should go in the future? But maybe it's already been tried before and it failed. I don't know. So I think it was just ideas like that.
And the book we're going to discuss today, Dominion, it's great for so many reasons, but for this particular reason that you're describing, it's great in that regard too, that if you go through the Rocky Mountains and this pass or this town or all these different landmarks and points, in Dominion we get to hear why they're named this or what happened in these places. So I learned so much about the 19th century and how all this stuff developed from your books. I really enjoyed it for that reason.
Glad that you enjoyed it. And I mean, that's the same reason. I mean, I learned a lot writing it too, because of course, an author, you spend a couple of years working your way through a big, large idea. You start out with some concept of what it's going to be, but as you're working through it, whatever you planned has to be thrown out the window, and you have to adjust along the way and recraft the narrative and recraft the themes of the ideas to suit what the research is telling you, or what your brain tells you was important, or new people that you never heard of before who become part of the story as you're going along. So even though you have it planned out, everything evolves. And as an author, you're, of course, learning on the fly about huge numbers of different things, and you're making decisions what to include, what not to include. And, the last time this story was tackled in Canada was the famous Pierre Berton books on the railway. But, I mean, I was shocked to learn those were originally published in 1970. And
yeah, quite a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, I was like 3 years old when that book came out. I mean, obviously, society has changed since then. Not only are there new historical documents have been uncovered, new themes in history have been explored, and just a general attitude in society to that maybe the older books, like the Pierre Berton books, were very much cheerleading, rah Canada, we've got to go. This is a heroic nation building episode, and nothing bad ever happened. It's just all awesome and it's great, and it brought us to where we are. And from someone in my era, you think, well, yeah, that's true, but okay, that's half the story, and all of it is not necessarily untrue, but it's only half the truth. There was a lot of damage to the environment. There was a lot of damage to multiple Indigenous cultures and societies along the way. There was various forms of racial discrimination. There was bad things happened in combination with the good things that happened. And a lot of people, of course, poured a lot of their lives and their energy into making this project, viable at the time. At the time, of course, it was the largest railroad ever built in the world and one of the most technically sophisticated engineering feats ever done up until that point. But it wasn't always easy, even for the people who benefited the most from its success. So I wanted to make sure that I included, not just the bright, shining, cheerleading aspects of the story, but sort of the more darker, shadowy aspects of it that, someone could say, oh, that's not very patriotic. And I said, well, I don't give a crap. This is history, and I'm not trying to be patriotic. I want the story. I want to know it all. I want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what's the point of having a brain that's half filled with fake information? Yeah, I mean, it was just such a chaotic period of time, and there was new technologies were coming on the global field. There was the invention of steam power and the invention of dynamite, and John A. MacDonald had the idea. He wanted to create this new country, but there was no country it was very hard to do this. I mean, there was no way to even travel across the Canadian Shield north of the Great Lakes. Was just incredibly difficult land to traverse. So most people who were wanting to get to the interior western part of what is now Canada traveled through the United States to do so. Because Americans were much quicker at building railways across their land, which was flatter and easier to construct railways on with a milder climate. And so it was pretty obvious that all of this terrain was eventually going to go into this American sphere, including the British colony of Vancouver Island and, British Columbia out on the coast. They, around this same time, the Americans had purchased Alaska from Russia. And of course, they had already expanded out and taken over the old Hudson's Bay Company trading outposts in today's Washington State and Oregon and Idaho and parts of Montana. I mean, that all used to be Hudson's Bay Company territory, but that was essentially taken by Americans. And so you have Alaska to the north, you have American states to the south, and there's this little colony of British Columbia was actively voting and being encouraged to join the United States. And they ultimately decided to link up with Canada on the condition that Canada would build a railway so that they could be connected geographically to the eastern part of the continent. And that's the only reason that British Columbia agreed to join Canada, and that's the only reason that Canada exists, because in the process of constructing that railway, they were able to prevent American expansion up into the three Canadian prairie provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, which, before that were just multiple Indigenous tribes and nations were occupying large regions on that until the disease had completely disrupted them and the loss of their food source, the buffalo, which, is its own sub-story altogether. But
the British Pacific colony is an interesting place at that time. In the city of Victoria, there are thousands of people there from all different kinds of backgrounds. How did that come to be such a big city, and why did they ultimately decide that they wanted to join Canada rather than the United States? Because, as you say in the book, they were more American at least in economic regards, if not, maybe not cultural regards. So why did they choose Canada to join?
Yeah, man, it's a good question. I mean, that's such a fascinating region at time of history too. I mean, it was primarily, I had mentioned that they were a fur trade outpost to begin with, so a very small scale. And then, disease was destroying many of the Indigenous populations around there. Gold was discovered, also, famously discovered in California in 1848 or 49. And then in 1858, also along the Fraser River, and then inland to the Caribou regions in British Columbia. And that, of course, drew tens of thousands of prospectors searching for gold. Many of them, came north from California. So they were either Americans or people who had been drawn to California from other places in the world. And they just kept migrating north. So all of a sudden, they have this small fur trading outpost was overswamped with tens of thousands of new people paddling up these rivers and hunting for gold. And there was obviously, many of them were Americans. Many of them, of course, came from multiple different European countries, and there was Chinese, and there were some Japanese. There was people from all over the place who had, this great quest for gold at that time. So they just kind of, within a month of gold being discovered, there were like just an inundation of tens of thousands of people swarming into this area. And the governor at the time, James Douglas, who was, just a fur trade fellow who was just in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company outpost, sort of unilaterally declared it to be a British colony and then proclaimed that it was, and then set about creating some of the infrastructure to try and manage this influx of people. And they did. He was actually remarkably successful in tamping down the sort of chaos and bloodshed and, warfare between Indigenous peoples and newcomers, and kept all these tens of thousands of people from also attacking each other or stealing each other's gold or everything. You can imagine the chaos that could have ensued with it. Yeah,
they brought in an important figure named Matthew Begbie, who was a judge. And you write in the book that he did more to bring order and justice than an army could have. So how did he have such a big effect on bringing some semblance of order to all of that?
Yeah, he was just actually a fascinating character. Not a very successful lawyer in London. When he heard about this opportunity to be a backwood judge in a wilderness outpost on the far side of the planet, he just kind of leapt at the opportunity. He immediately applied for the job and set off over there on a big adventure for himself. And he just arrived, and he was just a flamboyant character. He was very tall, he was very handsome. He had his famous looking beard and his mustache, and his clothes. He would always wear this hat, and he was very tall, and he'd like to put a wig on and put his robes on, and he just had this booming voice and a very charismatic character, and he immediately dominated rooms of people, and he didn't even know very much law at the time, and he didn't care. He just kind of read a few passages from some California law or some British law or whatever he felt at the time, and then pronounced. He had a big theater. He was all about theater, and the court was an imposing was almost like a play to him, where he's the central actor and everyone else has to be cowed into submission, and the protocols of the court were all about, kind of whatever he decided that he needed to control the situation, to manipulate the crowd into accepting whatever he was going to demand. And sometimes the hangings were very swift. He would just order a hanging and he would get the people to do it. He would read the room, and he really knew how to control people and control situations. And so that's what he would do, is he would break up mobs. He would never allow a mob to develop. He would separate them and get the crowd to be have a little bit of animosity towards each other, play them against each other. So there was no one who was ever going to overthrow him. And he didn't have a lot of constabulary. He didn't have a lot of military force to back up any of his decisions. He just imposed his will upon people, and people came to accept him. And he even learned multiple Indigenous languages so that he could communicate with some of the witnesses or some of the people in their languages. And he strove to achieve justice rather than a legal outcome. And of course, that's what was needed at the time. You couldn't have people following the letter of the law. There was, well, first of all, no one to impose the laws, no way of really even communicating to people what the laws were, since most of them were illiterate and from all these different countries. So he just strove to impose justice, something that was going to make people feel that the right thing happened. And he didn't care. He knew what the right thing was, and he didn't care how he got to it. He would make up some laws and say, this is what's going to happen. And people generally accepted what he did, and he just traveled for years. He just roved around with the accoutrements of the court and his little theatrical outfits that he would have. And you never know when he was going to show up or where he was going to appear in a town. People would just call him if there was some dispute. People, the crowds would have some perpetrators or alleged perpetrators arrested or held, and he would come and assess the situation, interview a bunch of people, determine what the outcome was, and then go and create the script that was going to result in the conclusion that he wanted. And he just wandered around. He was very famous, and he managed to impose order upon this tens of thousands of unruly people. It's quite incredible. It's hard to imagine that anyone would have that much charisma and that much force of personality to be able to do that. But he was definitely the right person at the right time and prevented probably a lot of bloodshed.
Yeah. Yes. So he's bringing some order and having a big impact in this region. And around 1870 or so, there's a delegation of people that go to Ottawa, and they get an agreement from John A. MacDonald, who already has a vision of building a railway, that they're going to build a railway across the country. They'll link British Columbia with the east. And John A. MacDonald, to put all this in motion, he has to get financial backers and has to find the right way to go across the country. So he sends out survey teams to the prairies. And one survey group, I guess, or pair, was a man named Sanford Fleming, who was an engineer, and his partner on the trip, George Monroe Grant, who wrote an account of it called Ocean to Ocean. They were quite an interesting story to learn about.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite stories of the entire book. As a historian and as a person, that's what I really love, accounts like that, where you get an unvarnished window into what life was like. If you find a perceptive, traveler and chronicler of a journey, you find that, and it's just like, oh, I'm so glad I found this, because now I understand what the world was like at that time a little bit better, And by reading this book and reading some of the letters they wrote as they journeyed from the eastern part of the country all the way out to Victoria, you get a sense of what the land was at that very point in time, that everything was just on the cusp of change. What was happening to the Indigenous groups? The treaties were just being negotiated in just to the north and west of the Great Lakes region. The colonists were just expanding. The railway was still obviously not, well, it was nowhere near being completed, but the route hadn't even been decided yet. And these people were out there assessing the land, assessing the culture, assessing the people, looking at the economy. They were always focused on geography, but they were also focused on politics too, like where the line is going to go. And they're just the fascinating journey that they had, and the food that they ate, and the weather they encountered, and how challenging and difficult it was. The many, many months of hard travel it took to traverse this land, with all its massive forests and its, the Canadian Shield, the rock on it, and how just trying to figure out, like, how could you possibly build anything over this? They were constantly wrestling with this idea of where could it go that we could even afford to build it? Like, looking at it from an engineer's point of view, they were like kind of flabbergasted, thinking, I don't know, how is this going to work? I mean, this is really hard terrain to get through. And then, of course, across the prairies, it was much easier. But of course, on the prairies, it was politics. There's still people on the prairies. There were still buffalo hunters at the time that they were crossing. There, the huge starvation that came afterwards and the massive disease that came afterwards was just beginning at that point. So the prairies was not really geographically challenging, but it could have been politically challenging. And then, of course, they came to the Rocky Mountains, which, once again, how do you build a railway through that? I mean, you had to hunt around for passes, and there were several different options for where pass could be constructed that a railway could get through. Because I guess we should mention, I mean, a railway is different than a road. There's a certain level of grade that has to be maintained, or, the trains can't get either up or down. It would just cause massive disaster. I believe it's 3% grade. I can't remember now what I wrote, but it pretty much has to be as level as possible for a railway. And so you really have to choose your route with great care. And if the Rockies Mountains was a huge challenge.
It's interesting to, while you're reading the book, to use something like Google Maps and look at the Rocky Mountains with this new perspective, that you're paying attention to the topography more and how the rivers flow through there, where the Trans-Canada Highway goes through, and where they built the railroad, how it goes from Calgary and up through passes to Kamloops and then down a river and over to Vancouver. You bring this fresh new appreciation to this whole region and start to try and begin to understand just how difficult it was what these men did at that time.
I think part of it is that that's where I live. I live right in the Rocky Mountains, and I have the Trans-Canada right there, and the railroad tracks, the CPR tracks, are within walking distance of where I live. And I'm sure it's not the same track, but it not significantly different location than where it was originally built in the 1880s. And if you do like hiking or just traveling or just driving from here to Vancouver, you're always following along where these tracks go, and you just shake your head and go, how did they even do this? Man, I don't even know how they would do it now, but to do it back then, I mean, that's what interested me in the whole story. I mean, there's the political aspect of it, like how Canada was created, but there's also the technical aspect of it, like from an engineering perspective. How do you accomplish that using the primitive technology that they had at the time? And of course, it was only recently that steam power was developed. Without that, of course, no one's building railways anywhere. But it was the invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel that really kick-started this whole railway craze that completely transformed North America and Europe within a matter of decades, and allowed all the major industrial mega projects that we associated with that time period to progress, like all the different harbors for ships, like blasting of New York Harbor, all the different famous tunnels and the canals that went everywhere, like the Erie Canal, for transporting of goods into the interior of continents, all the different the tunnels, famous, like the St. Gothard Tunnel in Europe, this massive, I think it's like 28 kilometers long, right through the mountains between Italy and Switzerland, or all these unbelievably like world-changing industrial mega projects were completed within a very short period of time after the invention of dynamite. Because before that, you had to use the only explosive that was available was the old black powder, which had been around for thousands of years. Where you just roll a keg of gunpowder up and light the fuse on fire and run away. Push it against. I mean, it would explode, and you'd certainly, as a human being, you don't want to be next to it. But I mean, that's not going to blast through a wall of granite and help you build a tunnel very easily. But with dynamite, which had 10 times the explosive capacity of black powder, you could also drill holes into the rock, insert a stick of dynamite into the stone, and then ignite it. And it would actually blow the rock outward rather than just sort of have an explosion at the face of the stone. So capacity for blasting through rock was astronomically improved by that. You could just blow your way through stuff. I mean, it still took years to do it, and it's still amazing to me that it was ever accomplished at all. But it would not have even been possible without those technologies. Now, of course, those are dangerous technologies too. And dynamite, before it was stabilized, it was being marketed from Alfred Nobel as nitroglycerin or Nobel's, blasting liquid or whatever. And it ended up exploding and killing many dozens of people in the first year it came on the market. It would blow up in warehouses and just kill workers. It would take out half. There's one massive explosion in San Francisco took out half of a city block, killed dozens of people. In the newspaper accounts at the time, I was always amazed to read these accounts because it would never be written that way now, where it's describing all the different body parts that are exploding against everyone's windows, and a piece of brain was found on a street corner near California Street, and someone's arm shattered the window on the printing press. You're reading this going, what? Is this for real? It would never be written like that now, but it just shows how dangerous this technology was. And of course, dynamite stabilized it, and that's what enabled the industrial development of Europe and North America to progress. But even with dynamite, which was safe, thousands of people died in North America from dynamite explosions. I mean, 600 Chinese workers alone died on the railway in the most dangerous sections of British Columbia in a matter of a few years. A lot of it was from tunnel collapses and dynamite explosions. I mean, there was one account I read where, it was always the Chinese workers who were given the most dangerous tasks. These workers were brought over from an impoverished, war-ravaged, disease-ridden China, which was undergoing its own severe political and economic challenges at that time. And there was a huge diaspora of Chinese peasant workers, illiterate workers who's just signed on to contracts, and they went all over the world building railways and doing mining projects, all over the world. The ones in Canada were primarily working on the railroad at that time. And until recently, actually, there was no known written account of anyone of Chinese origin who worked on this railroad in Canada, even though that's one of the greatest contributions to the nation-building infrastructure from any group of people anywhere. And part of it was because a lot of the workers were illiterate, and there's reasons for that. And part of it was, maybe there were some other documents, but some was lost. But there was one person who signed on, and he was an educated person who, due to political and family reasons, had to flee. And he ended up working on the CPR and writing an account of his years working there. And his journal had been lost for, hundreds of years, over 120 years, I think, until someone found it and translated it and brought it out. And it reveals an incredible new window into the laboring conditions of these thousands of people who were working, trying to build those railways through the rock passes, and some of the accounts of their camp life and how miserable it was, or how awful it was, and how many were injured or how many were dying. It's just really, really eye-opening for a person now who can't even conceive the conditions would be that bad for anyone working under anything in any of these first world countries. It's completely illegal and would never be allowed. But back then, people were dying of scurvy in the camps. Disease was ridden because, ironically, without a railway, how do you get proper supplies and food into the railway workers? It's a catch-22 kind of a situation, or a chicken and an egg. Like, one has to enable the other, but the people who are at the forefront of the construction would have to suffer a great deal. And the dynamite explosions that were killing so many of them. There was accounts of they would bravely climb up on a cliff above an area where they had to blast, say for a tunnel or to clear a flat area for the railway to go along. They would lower them down on a rope off the edge of the cliff. They'd be swinging there on these ropes because they didn't even have proper harnesses or anything. There was no safety equipment. Back then, they would just tie a rope around their waist, and their friends would lower them down over the cliff. They would have these piles of dynamite with them. They would stuff it into some cracks or put it there, and then they would light it, and then yank on the rope for the people to pull them up, and they'd be yanking the person up, and then the massive explosion happened below them. And it's almost like you just think, no, that couldn't possibly have happened. Well, yeah, it did. I mean, it was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed and was quite alarmed reading those stories. But I thought it was great that your book devoted a chapter to telling some of the stories of these Chinese workers who, as you say, came from impoverished conditions overseas and often had to do some of the most difficult work throughout the Rocky Mountains. And I suppose if we look at Vancouver today and one goes to Gastown in Vancouver, there's a Chinatown right next to it. And those two things probably have a connection to when work on the railway ended.
Yep. That is the origin of the Chinese diaspora population in Canada was railway. Because after it was constructed, well, as soon as it was constructed, they immediately started renovating it. So it's not like the work just dried up. But for a lot of them, they were here. Some were so impoverished they couldn't afford the passage back to China. Others, having been here for so long, decided that they had nothing back in China to go to, and they formed communities. And I mean, that's the origin of that. And yeah, a lot of them ended up in the Vancouver area.
I think as we maybe introduce one last topic for our discussion today, let's talk about the Métis people and their origin in the Red River region of Manitoba and their interactions with the Surveyors as this project was beginning, and the Northwest Rebellion in 1885 and how that helped a nearly bankrupt CPR get over the final stage to when they drove in the last spike. The Métis people and the figure of Louis Riel played an interesting role, sort of interweaved in the history of building this railway.
Yeah, it's a fascinating segment of the story, that's for sure. I mean, of course, the Métis are basically emerged from the centuries of fur trade, which went on before there was even the concept of political dominion over this land by either the American Empire or the budding Canadian Empire. The area around Red River, near essentially the city of Winnipeg these days, sort of became the focal point for this sort of mixed heritage people who were no longer working directly in the fur trade. And they started communities and started doing some farming or some trading and wanted to be doing, various business activities. Of course, it was more of a north-south business that they were involved in, and there was no real border at the time. But they had their interests were centered around that area. And of course, when you have, insensitive Eastern elites coming out to more or less make an imperial stamp upon this land, and they knock some heads together and to claim it all for for Canada, for the Eastern Canadian benefit. And there was already people living there. There was Indigenous people, and then the Métis, of course. And Louis Riel sort of emerged as the focal point of resistance to this insensitive attempt to sort of wipe out their culture and arbitrarily stamp a different authority upon to them. And that resulted in, the first Riel rebellion or Riel uprising or whatever term people want to use to describe it. That was around 1870. And then, of course, that was highlighting the sheer need for a railway at that time because, they couldn't even transport any troops to put down this rebellion. It was very, a lot of the Métis were just saying, why don't we just join the United States? Because a lot of other Métis are already living in what's now the United States. And so you get into all those different political arguments. And the big irony of the situation is that the second Riel rebellion, which came, 15 years later, the same person named Riel, he was unable to take up his role in Canada as an elected representative of the government because of antipathy towards him in the East, where they were always trying to kill him, even though he had been elected and should have been in the House of Commons. He was essentially exiled into the United States, and he had some mental health issues and disappeared for many years. But when there was renewed conflict in around 1884, 1885, a delegation of Métis also went down and retrieved Tyrel and brought him up to be also the leader of another uprising. And they were hoping to have their grievances heard by the East. And, the world was rapidly changing at that time. By then, the buffalo had mostly disappeared. There was widespread starvation and there was discontent. And, the railway had not yet been completed, but it had been partially completed. And that made all the difference. Now, of course, the terrain through which the railway was being constructed, as we had mentioned earlier, was so challenging, so engineering, like it was an engineering marvel, and the geography was almost insurmountable that it was basically bankrupting the entire entity. It was costing them 100 times more than they ever thought it was going to cost them to build it, and they were burning through money. It was really a matter of time before the thing was just going to collapse. It was massively in debt. They hadn't paid their workers. They had a big dividend payment that was coming out, and they had no money to pay it, and they were really like this was it. And of course, the Canadian banking system was so invested in this project that it would have essentially wiped out the entire economy of Canada as it then was. It was like a giant house of cards ready to collapse. It was either, and if it had collapsed, you'd have a bunch of partially completed railway segments that then would start degenerating back into the bogs and the muck from where they had recently been constructed. And the big irony is that the rebellion provided the political cover to get additional funding, government and other financial investment to complete the railway so that they could be able to have the idea, we need to finish this railway so we can get troops out to put down the rebellion. So this is the funny thing. If Tyrel had not been brought back and no rebellion had ever happened, it probably would have resulted in the desired outcome for those people, the collapse of the political entity of Canada. But by pushing pushing forward their demands and engaging in some violence against some settlers, some attacks on communities, attacks on various police forces that were out there, that actually stimulated the investment that allowed the railway to avoid bankruptcy and to spur its construction and to get troops brought out there, which put down the rebellion. And so it's just kind of interesting that Tyrel more or less bookends the two periods of the railway. He was there at the very beginning to establish the need for having a railway with the first rebellion, and he was there at the very end for, ironically, staving off the bankruptcy of the nearly complete railway. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just a fascinating part of the story, and it's...
Yeah. And interestingly enough, this wasn't by design, but today in Canada, as we're recording this, it's November 7th, and the last spike was driven in at a place called, I've never said this before, so correct me if I'm wrong, it's Craigellachie?
Well, I think your interpretation of that word is as good as mine is going to be. That's what it looks like on it's some Scottish Highland name. I think you probably got it right. Sounds good to me.
So November 7th, 1885, which is 139 years ago today, the last spike was driven in and MacDonald's dream was completed. And that's, it really was a remarkable feat that so many thousands of people dedicated their lives or their labor to making that happen. And it ended up having the effect that MacDonald wanted, but, they were barely able to pull it off, but they did.
Yeah. I mean, for the first time ever, you could travel across from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean within, the new country of Canada. I have no doubt that without that railway, there wouldn't be a country of Canada, because you can't actually have a nation. You can say, well, the only way to travel between two different parts of the nation is to go to a third nation and come back up into it. I mean, it's a bit silly, right? We would have all been, part of the American empire at that time. Canada wouldn't exist. But yeah, so as soon as that spike was there, you could actually transport people, goods, services, information. Information is not to be overlooked. That's one of the key things. And with steamships coming across the Pacific Ocean from Hong Kong to Vancouver, then by railways and the new telegraphs that were built right along the railway lines, connecting all the way to Eastern Canada and the ports in Montreal, which connects to ships, which go right to London. I mean, there you have your British Empire. I mean, important link in the political chain of the British Empire, right? So
this book that we're discussing, it's called Dominion, The Railway and the Rise of Canada. If people are interested in following what you're doing or keeping up to date with what's coming up next, or they want to see a list of your 10 books, where can they go to keep up to date with what you're doing?
Well, I guess a Google search would bring up a lot of it. I mean, I do have a website that's, www.stephenrbown.net. And I have information on all my books up on there and different reviews, or people can send me a note if they want to. And I get a lot of notes and I like responding to them. I like hearing. People always find, there's a little mistake on page 317, and that's okay. I correct it for the soft cover. It's all good. Yeah.
And I'll tell viewers and listeners too, Stephen is spelled with PH and R is the middle initial and Bown is BOWN, just to make sure that you don't
that's true.
put
Don't
the
let the
R
R
in
slip
Bown
in
and spell Brown or something.
That's what I get all the time, yeah.
Yeah. And well, I have to admit that when I first contacted you, I did that too. So I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. No, it's no worries.
Yeah.
I think it's because the R in people's mind, it just goes there.
Yeah.
Probably if my middle name wasn't an R. And the reason I had to put an R in is because when I first started out being an author, 25 years ago, there was already a Stephen Bown and a Stephen G. Bown. And I looked it up and said, well, you can't pick those. And I can't have the same name as someone else. So I had to put an R into it. And then the R becomes Brown. Whatever.
Yeah.
It's first world problem.
Yeah. I really enjoyed reading Dominion. I think it's a great book to either introduce or reacquaint or add information to Canadian people's sense of their history and how things were built, how our country and our nation was built. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's been my pleasure to have this conversation. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about it, and good questions. Thanks for having me.